In this video, we now turn to unions in professional sports. So, in general, unions typically fall into two categories: craft unions and industrial unions. Craft unions date back to the medieval guilds, and these are groups of skilled artisans who joined together to prevent others from entering the city to undercut their prices. Industrial unions are much younger than craft unions. Industrial unions take their names from the types of output they produce. Okay, so such as the United Auto Workers, United Steel Workers. So let's look at these two figures we have here. So in the left figure, craft unions would increase their wages by limiting access to the unions and to skills. So with craft unions, the firms do not hire workers into the craft union. Instead, the firms sign the contract with the unions, and the unions will assign their workers to employers through a hiring hall. So in effect, the craft unions will make the labor supply curve vertical at the restricted size of the labor pool, which is seen in the figure. So the result is a union wage that exceeds competitive wage. So if we look here, you see the demand for labor, the supply of non-union, and then the supply of union. So with craft unions, they will restrict the amount of people that they can have in their union. And in doing so, they will have a lower level of quantity than if lower level of labor than with a competitive market, but they will be able to negotiate the higher wage. Now, industrial units, on the other hand, represents workers with many different skills. With industrial unions, the hiring and firing is left up to the employer. Now, industrial unions do, by collectively working together, they push up wages, but they do through the collective bargaining. With collective bargaining, unions meet with their employers to produce any agreement that they may specify pay, employment levels, and other working conditions. Industrial unions seek to push wages above the competitive level, which is shown here. So with without a union, you have the labor demand, labor supply, and the wage will be W and U. But with unions acting as one, so when you have the industrial union who is acting as one voice and has that power, they essentially become a monopoly. And so with that, they will maximize their profits as measured by total salary or benefits at the point where the marginal revenue equals the supply. And so with that, you will have a L, which is LU, which is fewer employers, but higher wages. So industrial unions will induce, so how do they do this? So industrial unions will induce employers to accept their demands by engaging in threatening behaviors to engage in strike. By threatening to engage in a strike. A strike occurs when workers act together to remove the labor input from the production process, so they walk off the job. This is in contrast with a lockout when the management of the firm does not permit the labor from operating. Now, the need to stage or threaten a damaging strike means industrial unions must get their strength from being inclusive. This means they cannot succeed unless the firm's employees remain loyal to the union during a strike. This is different from craft unions, where their power comes from being exclusive and keeping out competing workers. So, both craft and industrial unions cause the wages to rise, but they do so in different ways, basically. Now, opponents of unions assert that this creates an inefficiency, which by limiting employer output. Now, that's because higher wages means higher cost of production, and that can also hurt domestic workers as well as a whole. That's why you see things like outsourcing, where a lot of industries will produce in other countries and then import them in. Now, union supporters will counter this by saying that unions, especially industrial unions, often operate in industries where monopolies are already restricting employment and creating deadweight laws. So they're saying that a lot of times they will operate in these industries where the firms already have so much power that there's already been a deadweight laws created. And so their goal was to just transfer the profits from the owners to the employees. So the basic idea is that by protecting workers and preventing conflict, unions increase the marginal revenue product of labor, and they're able to shift the demand at times. In the end, whether it's the craft unions or industrial unions, they tend to have lower employment levels and higher wages. Although again, they achieve these goals in different ways. So now let's talk about professional sports. All right. So as mentioned in a previous video, most leagues all leagues have players' associations. So the professional sports unions are like craft unions in that they represent workers with similar skills, but they engage in collective bargaining with the employers who do the hiring and firing, like industrial unions. So the sports unions are kind of a hybrid between craft and industrial. Now, sports unions are unlike all of the unions in two ways. One, they don't engage in wage negotiations. They don't negotiate for specific player salaries or things like that. But they do bargain over the general framework within which individual players and their agents negotiate with the teams. So they can negotiate things like the salary cap, which is the total, percentage of revenue, the total amount that the owners have to pay their players. Now, the major sports unions and leagues which they negotiate sometimes advocate positions that differ from those in other unions or firms. So, for example, after the NBA lockout of 1998-1999, the NBA imposed a fixed salary scale on players over the objection of the unions, which advocated a more free market. So there are conflicts within there. Overall, though, for decades, all four player associations of the major sports in the United States and North America have strove for free agency. And the reason why is that we talked about the reserve clause before, but with free agency, teams had the ability to go to different employers. Players had the ability to go to different employers, different teams, to get more competitive wages. So, those are the kind of the team sports. You also have individual sports, such as tennis or golf, that also have associations that represent them, represent their interest. But they do differ pretty significantly from the players' associations. So the ATP and WTA, which are the different unions in those sports, they do closely resemble craft unions. They do not specify how much each tournament pays specific players, but they do help to establish a reward system of the tournaments so that all players will earn in some way. So they also have rule books which specify the regulations, and they also have collective bargaining with the different sporting bodies as well. The biggest difference, however, between these professional associations within golf and tennis and the player associations in other sports, basketball, hockey, baseball, and football, is that with the professional associations in tennis and golf, they do not engage in negotiations with a single management group. So instead, they tend to set rules for sponsors who wish to stage a tournament. Much like the way that construction unions, which is a typical craft union, sets rules for developers who wish to construct offices or apartment buildings. Now, also unlike most other unions, the ATP and WTA are strictly segregated by gender. So you have a male golf union, female golf union, male tennis union, female tennis union. Okay. So this is mostly because a lot of tournaments are set up differently. There's different pay structures, different revenue streams, and so forth. So that's just a brief overview of the unions in professional sports.